It was one of those southern autumn evenings that felt older than time itself, quiet, heavy, and still. The kind of night when the air holds the scent of dry leaves and cooling asphalt, and even the sound of your own tires on the road feels too loud. It was October 21st, 1994, a Friday, the end of midterms at Western Kentucky University. For 23-year-old Audrey Mae, it was supposed to be the start of a relaxing weekend back home in Somerset, a place where her mother still baked on Fridays and her father still checked the porch light when she drove in late. She'd packed light, a duffel bag, her textbooks, and a few cassette tapes for the drive. Friends said she seemed tired but cheerful, already talking about helping her mom decorate for Halloween. Around 6:30 p.m., she left campus, merging onto Highway 68 as the sun sank behind the hills. It was a familiar route, one she'd taken countless times before, but in 1994, much of that stretch was still rural. Long empty lanes, old gas stations, and miles of pine and oak that seemed to swallow the last traces of daylight. Audrey called her mother from a payphone outside a small diner in Bowling Green at 6:47 p.m. It was a short call. She said she was stopping for gas and a snack, maybe a soda for the road. Her mother told her to drive safe and that she'd leave the porch light on. That would be the last time anyone heard her voice. When the sun rose the next morning and her car wasn't in the driveway, her mother knew something was wrong. Audrey was punctual to a fault, never late, never unaccounted for. By mid-morning, her parents were on the phone with police, and by afternoon, deputies from Barron County were driving the stretch of Route 90, where she should have passed through the night before. They found nothing. No tire marks, no broken guardrail, no sign of a crash. Her credit card records showed a final purchase $12.47 at a small Amoco station just outside Cave City. The clerk on duty remembered her. He said she was polite, smiling, wearing a university hoodie and jeans. She bought gas, a pack of gum, and a Diet Coke. Then she left, heading east toward Somerset. But he also remembered something else. A dark green pickup truck had pulled in just after her. The driver didn't buy anything. He just sat there, idling near the side of the building, lights off. The clerk couldn't recall the man's face, only the shape of the truck, and that it followed her out a minute later. That small detail, barely noticed at the time, would become the first and only tangible clue. By that evening, police put out a bolo for Audrey's blue Honda Civic. Helicopters scanned the tree lines near the highway, and volunteers walked ditches with flashlights, calling her name. The sound of their voices faded quickly in the thick woods. Each passing hour felt like the air itself was closing in on the truth, hiding it under the hum of crickets and the distant roar of trucks on the interstate. Her friends at the university were interviewed. None of them could think of anyone who might want to hurt her. She wasn't dating anyone seriously. She didn't party much. Her professors described her as responsible, thoughtful, a journalism student who kept a small notebook everywhere she went. She wasn't the type to just leave. As the weekend turned to Monday, local news stations began covering the disappearance. They showed her senior photo, light brown hair, blue eyes, a calm, unassuming smile. The kind of face people recognized instantly. Within days, Somerset felt smaller. Strangers showed up at the family's house with casseroles, flashlights, or just tears. Audrey's father stood outside most nights with a flashlight of his own, pointing it toward the road as if he could somehow guide her home. By the end of the week, search teams had combed more than 40 miles of highway and back roads. Divers checked 2 ponds near Mammoth Cave, where witnesses thought they'd seen something glinting in the water. It wasn't her car. The police kept coming back to that gas station. The clerk, a man named Terry Holt, sat for multiple interviews, each time adding only small fragments. He thought the truck might have been a Ford F-150, maybe early 82nds. He couldn't remember the license plate, but he recalled the sound, a low rattle, like something loose under the hood. For investigators, it wasn't much to go on. They checked nearby motels, diners, and rest stops, but no one else had seen Audrey or the truck that night. No sign of her car on any security footage, though most cameras in that area were old or unreliable. It was as if she'd simply vanished somewhere between the gas station lights and the shadows of the next county. Her father drove that stretch every day for months afterward, sometimes stopping by the side of the road just to stare into the trees. He once told a reporter, "There's something out there, something we're not seeing." But as the first week turned into 2, and 2 into a month, hope began to dim. Search costs rose, tips slowed, and for a quiet Kentucky family that once measured time in birthdays and school breaks, life began to split into a new kind of calendar before Audrey disappeared, and after. The only thing certain was that she had made it to that gas station. She had filled her tank. She had smiled. And then, somewhere along those narrow, pine-lined roads of Barron County, the world simply erased her. No skid marks, no witnesses, no sound. Just a missing girl, a highway at night, and a dark pickup truck no one could ever quite remember clearly. And for more than 20 years, that was where her story would stay suspended in silence, somewhere between that last phone call and the long, empty road home. The first 72 hours after a disappearance are the most critical. Everyone in law enforcement knows that. But as the clock ticked past the third day, since Audrey Mae was last seen, detectives in Barron County were running out of places to look. The narrow highways between Bowling Green and Somerset stretched for miles, weaving through farmland, dense pine forests, and forgotten logging trails that hadn't seen a truck in decades. The area was a maze of dirt roads and creek beds, and if something or someone had gone wrong out there, it could have stayed hidden forever. In those first weeks, the search felt endless. Police brought in helicopters and canine units, while volunteers from nearby towns, truckers, church groups, college students spread out across the region. They walked shoulder to shoulder through overgrown fields, calling her name, stopping every few feet when they thought they saw something glint in the grass. Local firefighters combed the banks of Beaver Creek, dragging the muddy water for any sign of a vehicle. They found a rusted shopping cart, an old tire, a deer skull. Nothing that belonged to Audrey. Her family watched every minute of it. Her father stood near the command post off Route 90 every morning before sunrise, pouring black coffee into a paper cup that trembled in his hands. Her mother handed out missing flyers, her voice hoarse from repeating the same sentence again and again. She was driving a blue Honda Civic. "Please, just look out for her." Those words became a routine, almost a prayer. By the end of the first week, local TV stations had picked up the story. Reporters showed the same picture over and over. Audrey's college portrait, her smile faint but confident, the kind that made people lean forward when they saw it. News anchors spoke about her as if she were a daughter everyone somehow knew. The coverage brought attention but also noise. Within days, the sheriff's office was flooded with tips. Some were hopeful. Others bordered on cruel. A farmer swore he'd seen a young woman matching her description walking along a fence line 2 counties over. Another caller claimed she'd been seen hitchhiking on I-65. None of it panned out. As the days turned colder, the search perimeter expanded. Deputies checked old gravel pits, drainage culverts, and stretches of forest that hadn't been mapped in years. On the 10th day, a volunteer team discovered what looked like disturbed dirt near a narrow logging road that branched off Highway 31. At first glance, it seemed promising: fresh earth, tire impressions, and what looked like an indentation, as if something heavy had been dragged. Investigators brought in cadaver dogs and spent nearly 12 hours digging and sifting, but beneath the topsoil, there was nothing. No car parts, no clothing, no trace of Audrey. Just the smell of wet earth and disappointment. The case began to lose its shape. Rumors started to fill the silence left by facts. In small towns like these, gossip traveled faster than truth. Some said she'd run away pressure from school, maybe a secret boyfriend, maybe she just needed to disappear. Others whispered about a jealous ex, though police confirmed Audrey hadn't been dating anyone seriously. Then came the darker theories, that she'd been taken by a truck driver passing through, or that there was a serial predator operating along Kentucky's rural highways. The idea of a drifter soon caught the public's attention. 2 days after she vanished, a man had been spotted near the Amaco station where Audrey bought gas. He'd been sleeping in his truck behind the lot, a transient known locally as Red Doherty, who picked up day labor wherever he could find it. Witnesses said he'd been drinking that night and left shortly after Audrey drove away. When detectives tracked him down, he denied even seeing her. His alibi, staying overnight at a friend's farm, was shaky, but not impossible. They tested his truck for any trace of Audrey's presence. Nothing. No fingerprints, no hair, no sign she'd ever been there. The investigation slowed, leads grew thinner. Police retraced the route dozens of times, following every possible turnoff. At one point, they even drained a section of an old quarry where locals dumped trash, but again, nothing. Every theory collapsed under the weight of time and the absence of evidence. By November, the search radius was over 100 square miles. The leaves had fallen. The woods that once hid everything were now stripped bare, revealing only more emptiness. Detectives drove those back roads until they knew every curve by memory, the same way her father did. They'd pass small crosses and roadside memorials from other accidents, small reminders of lives that had vanished before. But there was never one for Audrey, not yet. Her family still hoped she was alive somewhere. The town of Somerset held a candlelight vigil the week before Thanksgiving. Hundreds came. Her college roommate, Hannah Reed, spoke softly through tears, saying Audrey had been planning to apply for internships in Nashville. She had plans, Hannah said. She wasn't the kind of person who just disappears. That sentence stuck with people. Wasn't the kind of person who just disappears. But the hard truth was that anyone could, given the wrong night and the wrong stranger. By early December, the sheriff's department began to scale back. Search crews were dismissed. Funding was stretched thin. The official statement used the same phrasing every family dreads: all active field operations have been suspended pending new information. To her parents, that sounded like the end. Christmas came and went quietly. Her father kept her gifts in the same spot under the tree, refusing to take them down even after New Year's. Her mother stopped answering phone calls unless it was from the police. They kept the porch light on every night, the same one Audrey would have seen from the driveway when she pulled in late from school. It burned for months without ever going out. The following spring brought nothing new. The Kentucky State Police formally added Audrey Mae to the state's missing persons registry, assigning her a case number and filing her into a database among hundreds of other names, people who'd walked out of gas stations, parked at rest stops, or taken a wrong turn and never come home. The town moved on, as towns do, but her family didn't. Her father still drove her route every few weeks, keeping a map marked with red pins showing where she might have turned, where someone might have seen her. He spoke to retired truckers, gas attendants, and farmers who remembered nothing useful. Her photo stayed in his wallet, folded neatly, creased at the edges. Years later, investigators would admit that by January 1995, the case had already gone cold. There was no evidence of foul play, but also no evidence she'd left on her own. Just a void. The drifter's name disappeared from the reports. The gas station attendant eventually moved away, and the people who had searched those woods began to forget the details of where they'd looked. By the time the next autumn rolled around, her flyer was one among dozens on the wall inside the sheriff's office, sun-faded, curling at the corners. Another face on the Kentucky Missing Persons Board. And yet, in the silence that followed, the land itself seemed to hold something back. Those endless stretches of pines, the ones that swallowed her last drive home, were about to keep their secret for a very long time. Because beneath those same trees just a few miles off Route 90 something waited, buried deep under years of roots and rain. Something no one would find until 21 years later, when the ground finally gave it up. For years, the case existed only as a file in a metal drawer, a thin folder with a fading photo paper clipped to the front, her name handwritten in blue ink across the tab. Audrey Mae, missing, October 1994. It had been passed from one investigator to another, each promising to take another look, each eventually setting it aside when leads ran dry. Between 1995 and 2010, the silence around Audrey's disappearance deepened into something almost permanent. Her parents never stopped searching, but their lives began to shrink around the loss. Her mother, Evelyn, kept the same porch light burning every night, the one she'd promised Audrey would guide her home. The bulb was replaced dozens of times over the years. Sometimes, She'd stand on the porch with her coat wrapped around her shoulders, staring down the road until the darkness blurred. Her father, Harold, grew quieter, older. He kept the same map pinned to the wall of his garage, red lines tracing the route between Bowling Green and Somerset, faded marks where search teams had once combed the woods. He stopped talking about if she comes home and started saying when she does. The seasons kept passing. By the early 2000s, the missing posters had long been removed from shop windows. New cases took their place, new names, new faces, new families waiting for closure. Audrey's photo ended up in a binder labeled Cold Cases, Unresolved Western Kentucky District, one of hundreds. A case number in a database, a file rarely opened. Still, every few years, a local reporter would run a short anniversary piece. 20 years later, the headline would read, "No trace of missing WKU student." It was always the same details. A young woman on her way home, a last phone call to her mother, a dark pickup truck that no one could identify, and always the same unanswered question. How could someone just vanish on a highway so ordinary, so traveled, without leaving a single trace behind? Her mother never saw an answer. In 2009, 15 years after Audrey disappeared, Evelyn Mae passed away quietly in her sleep. The light on the porch was still on. Harold replaced the bulb the next day and left it burning, just as she had. When neighbors offered condolences, he said, "She's still out there somewhere. And when they find her, I want that light to be the first thing she sees." The investigation, though, had frozen in place. Evidence degraded. Witnesses moved away. Memories faded. Technology had changed, but the data hadn't caught up. There were no phone pings, no dash cams, no GPS logs from 1994. The only surviving records were handwritten notes from deputies and a stack of grainy black and white photographs from the original search. Then, in 2011, something shifted. A new detective, Sergeant Lee Barnett, joined the Barron County Sheriff's Office. She was in her late 30s, methodical and quiet, known for taking old files home and reading them until sunrise. One afternoon, she found herself in the archive room, sorting through boxes marked "Inactive, no leads." Inside one, she saw Audrey's photo. The name caught her eye. She'd grown up hearing it. Her mother used to tell her never to stop for gas alone on Route 90 after dark. Barnett requested to reopen the file under a cold case review, a procedure meant mostly for organization and digitization. But as she read through the reports, she noticed small details that didn't fit. The primary suspect, the drifter everyone had whispered about for years, had actually been cleared by DNA in another case back in 1998. That information had never made it into Audrey's file. He was innocent, which meant the working assumption for years had been wrong. Then she noticed something stranger. The original incident logs mentioned a traffic camera near the Route 90 junction, one that might have captured vehicles passing through the area around the time Audrey disappeared. The notes stated that the footage was requested by investigators in 1994, but there was no record of it ever being received. The log simply read, "Tape unavailable, archive missing." Barnett dug deeper, requesting records from the Kentucky Department of Transportation. It took weeks, but when the files arrived, she found an entry from late October 1994. It showed that a small section of Route 90, less than 2 miles from where Audrey last bought gas, had been temporarily closed for soil instability and ground movement. Crews had been dispatched to stabilize terrain, before reopening it several days later. The notation was routine, almost meaningless at first glance, but the timing aligned eerily with Audrey's disappearance. Barnett visited the site, mentioned in the report. It was a narrow strip of road lined with pines, the ground sloping into a dense thicket of brush. The area had changed, guardrails replaced, asphalt repaved, but the terrain still dipped in an unnatural way, like something beneath it had once given way and been patched over. She marked the coordinates in her notebook, writing just 2 words beside them: check records. When she requested the original construction permits, she hit another dead end. The subcontractor listed no longer existed. Its records dissolved when the owner died in 2003. The company had been local, small, family-run, and its paperwork, if it survived at all, was likely boxed up in someone's barn or attic. Still, Barnett couldn't shake the feeling that something had been missed. Every missing person case leaves behind a residue, a pattern of small inconsistencies that, when lined up, tell their own story. Here, the story pointed back to the land itself. Meanwhile, the town had its own explanations. In Somerset, people had begun referring to the woods off Route 90 as the Swallowed Place. It was half joke, half warning, a stretch of road where cars sometimes lost traction, where fog pooled thick on cold mornings, where headlights seemed to fade before reaching the trees. Truckers said the pines were cursed, that the land shifted like it was hiding something. A few locals swore they'd seen strange lights there late at night, beams flickering beneath the trees like someone searching with a flashlight. Audrey Mae didn't believe in stories, but he'd heard them all. Sometimes he'd drive out there just to sit in his truck by the shoulder, engine off, window down, listening to the stillness. He said the place never sounded right, no crickets, no birds, just wind moving through the branches. He told a neighbor once, "If I were her, I'd be somewhere near here." By 2012, Barnett had compiled her findings into a new report: cleared suspect, missing camera footage, unexplained road closure. But without physical evidence, the case couldn't move forward. There were no new witnesses, no recovered items, no sign of the car. It was as if both Audrey and her vehicle had been erased from existence. Still, she filed an official request for a ground-penetrating radar scan of the Route 90 slope, citing historical anomalies in the soil records. The request was denied due to cost. It would take years before anyone reconsidered. For now, Audrey Mae's name returned to the shelf, her file a little thicker but no closer to an answer. And yet, the coordinates Barnett had written in her notebook, that small stretch of road, marked by soil instability, would later become the very place where everything changed. Because under those same pines, beneath layers of clay and roots that had grown for 2 decades, the ground still held what no one could find. It would take 21 years for the earth to give it back. Every case on this channel takes weeks of research, fact-checking, and long nights uncovering the truth. We do this because these stories matter and someone still deserves to be remembered. If you want us to keep bringing these real mysteries to light, please like, subscribe, and share which part of today's case hit you hardest. For more mysterious solved cold cases, the links are waiting for you in the description below. Now, let's get back to the case. It was a gray, humid morning in May of 2015, the kind where the air clung to the skin and the fog sat heavy over the pines. A construction crew was clearing land off the old Route 90 bypass, preparing the ground for a new housing development. The site had been untouched for decades, an odd, triangular patch of land the county once marked as unstable soil. But that morning, the developer had finally gotten clearance to start digging. The foreman remembered saying it felt strange, working a place that had been fenced off for so long, but to him it was just another job site. Around 9:20 a.m., one of the excavators hit something solid. The operator assumed it was old debris, maybe rock, maybe a rusted pipe, but when the bucket scraped across the surface, it made a sound no one mistook for stone. A hollow metallic ring. The machine stopped. Workers gathered, leaning over the edge of the pit, and through the layers of wet earth they could see it, something blue, something smooth. It took a moment to realize what they were looking at. The curved edge of a car roof, crushed under tons of packed clay. They called the foreman, who called the sheriff's office. Within an hour, deputies arrived and roped off the site. The crew stood back as investigators climbed down into the pit, their boots sinking in the soft soil. The car was mangled, the frame warped by pressure and time. Pine roots had grown through the windows and wrapped themselves through the doorframes like veins. On the hood, flakes of faded blue paint still clung to the metal. A Honda emblem was barely visible. As they dug carefully around the vehicle, they found that the front end was angled downward, as if it had been driven or pushed into a cavity before being buried. Inside, behind the shattered windshield, the outline of a skeleton sat slumped in the driver's seat. The remains were partially covered by rotted fabric, the kind that once might have been a college sweatshirt. When the forensics team arrived, they began documenting everything. Every inch of soil, every fragment of glass. Near the passenger side floorboard, a purse was recovered, worn, the leather cracked, but still intact. Inside were the remains of a wallet, a university ID card long faded from water damage, and a small silver keychain in the shape of a crescent moon. But what caught everyone's attention was the phone case wedged between the seat and the console. It was split and brittle from pressure, its engraving still visible under a thin film of mud. 2 letters, A, M. Within hours, the car's VIN was processed. The results came back before sunset. The number matched a blue Honda Civic registered to Audrey Mae, the same car that had vanished without a trace in October of 1994. Word spread fast. By evening, local reporters were stationed at the construction site, their voices hushed as they spoke into cameras. Authorities believe they have located the vehicle belonging to missing Western Kentucky student Audrey Mae, who disappeared 21 years ago. The word sounded surreal to anyone who'd lived through it. 21 years. When detectives informed Harold May, he didn't speak for a long time. He just stared at the photo of the recovered car, his hand trembling slightly against the paper. For years, he'd told people she was out there somewhere, that someday she'd be found. He just never imagined she'd been that close all along. The investigation that followed was meticulous. Forensic teams began excavating the surrounding area, removing soil layer by layer to preserve anything that might explain how the car ended up there. They found evidence the ground above had once been disturbed and refilled, proof that the car hadn't simply slid into a sinkhole. Someone had buried it intentionally. The clay had hardened over time, sealing it completely. Inside the vehicle, they recovered what little remained of Audrey's belongings: a faded denim jacket, a hair clip, and a student notebook warped from moisture. The seatbelt on the driver's side was still buckled. Forensic anthropologists later noted that detail in their report. It suggested she hadn't been thrown forward, that the car hadn't crashed in the traditional sense. The discovery site itself told its own story. According to county records, the patch of land had been part of a construction project in late 1994, the same week Audrey disappeared. The project had been halted briefly due to unstable ground, but the exact coordinates where her car was found matched that same unstable zone listed in the highway construction log that Sergeant Barnett had flagged years earlier in her review of the case. When she got the call that afternoon, Barnett drove straight to the scene. Standing near the excavation pit, she looked down at the crushed car, half embedded in the earth. Everything she'd suspected: the missing camera footage, the road closure, the instability that never made sense — it was all connected. She told reporters later, "The ground held the truth. We just didn't know where to look." The forensic analysis took months. Soil layers showed compression, consistent with heavy machinery. Chemical testing revealed traces of diesel oil and hydraulic fluid, likely from industrial equipment. Investigators began reviewing construction company records from 1994 to identify who had worked that site. Several companies had bid for the project, but one subcontractor name appeared in both the 1994 and 2015 documents: Coleman Excavation Services. The owner, James R. Coleman, had operated in the area for decades, known for grading and earth-moving contracts along Route 90. He'd retired years earlier and was living quietly in Elizabethtown. On paper, there was no reason to suspect him of anything. But when detectives began cross-referencing his past, a pattern emerged: small complaints, a few assault charges from the late 1980s, all eventually dropped. Investigators reached out to him for questioning, careful not to reveal the full scope of what they'd found. When they showed him photos of the recovered site, Coleman admitted his crew had been working that stretch of Route 90 inches the fall of 1994. He said he remembered it vaguely: a mudslide, maybe some ground erosion, but claimed he'd never heard of any missing person connected to it. Still, when they pressed him for details about who operated the equipment that week, his answers grew less certain. "It's been a long time," he said. "We covered a lot of ground back then." The statement didn't sit right. Forensic teams finished their preliminary report in late summer. Audrey's remains were officially identified through dental records and DNA testing. The news made headlines across Kentucky. Candlelight vigils were held at Western Kentucky University and in Somerset, where locals left flowers by the roadside near the site. Some of them had helped search for her 2 decades earlier. For them, the discovery was closure, but not peace. Reporters covering the case noted a haunting detail. Audrey's car had been buried less than 2 miles from where she stopped for gas the night she vanished. She had been right there, hidden under the same road. Hundreds of people had driven every day for 21 years. The case that had once faded into rumor was now a crime scene again. Detectives believed whoever buried the car had access to heavy equipment, knowledge of the terrain, and a reason to keep that spot undisturbed. The timeline fit perfectly with the old construction logs. When investigators revisited the 2011 file that Sergeant Barnett had reopened, they realized she had unknowingly written the coordinates of the very spot where Audrey's car had been found. It had been there all along, just 6 feet below the surface. As news cameras filmed the final removal of the car, a crowd gathered behind the police tape. Some of them had searched those woods back in 1994, their flashlights sweeping the trees not 50 yards away from where she'd been. Watching the car rise from the earth was like seeing a ghost pulled from the past. And for the first time in 21 years, the story of Audrey Mae wasn't about what was missing. It was about what had finally been found. But even as investigators sealed the evidence, one question still hung in the air. Who buried her there? Because somewhere out there, the person who covered that car with dirt and roots had been walking free for 2 decades, believing no one would ever find it. The truth, as it turned out, wasn't buried much deeper than that. When investigators finally had time to study the site, they realized that what they were looking at wasn't an accident, it was something deliberate. The layers of soil told a story. Beneath the packed clay, there was a pattern, a distinct separation between natural sediment and a layer that had been mechanically disturbed, then compressed again. A forensic geologist brought in from Louisville confirmed it. The ground hadn't collapsed on its own. It had been opened, refilled, and leveled, likely using construction-grade equipment. Whoever buried Audrey Mae's car had known exactly how to make it disappear. As the days went on, detectives combed through every inch of the pit. They documented the soil composition, the orientation of the car, even the way the pine roots had grown through the wreckage. One finding stood out immediately. The driver's seatbelt was still fastened. That detail changed everything. It meant Audrey wasn't likely the one behind the wheel when the car went into the ground. Someone had either buckled her in after the fact or placed her there intentionally. The positioning of her body, the lack of any significant bone trauma, it didn't fit with a crash or a sinkhole. This wasn't an accident. Around the vehicle, investigators found faint traces of oil residue and hydraulic fluid consistent with older construction machinery. A few feet from the rear bumper, embedded in the dirt, they also uncovered what looked like the corner of a torn tarp, its fibers degraded but still visible under ultraviolet light. Lab testing would later reveal traces of motor grease on it. It wasn't much, but it hinted at an attempted cover-up, something meant to conceal the burial, not nature reclaiming the site. When the county records office was subpoenaed for old leasing and permit data from 1994, the pieces began falling into place. Back then, that section of Route 90 had been part of a short-term road widening project. The leaseholder for that parcel of land, according to archive documents, was a construction contractor named James R. Coleman. Coleman had been a familiar name to the department, though not for this case. In the late 1980s, he'd served a short sentence for aggravated assault after attacking a female hitchhiker outside Glasgow. The victim had survived, but her injuries were severe. At the time, investigators had written it off as an isolated act of violence. But now, looking back, the similarities were difficult to ignore. An isolated road, a young woman, a man with access to heavy equipment and remote property. Detectives tracked Coleman down in Elizabethtown, where he'd been living quietly since his release. He was 63 now, retired. His company dissolved years ago. When they showed up at his door in late summer, 2015, he seemed unsurprised. He invited them inside, calm and polite, offering coffee like he had nothing to hide. When asked if he remembered the construction on Route 90 inches, 1994. He nodded slowly. He said the ground back then had been soft, that a small section had caved in during a storm. He claimed his crew had stabilized it, poured fresh fill, and moved on. But when investigators asked whether he remembered hearing about a missing college student from that same week, his tone shifted. He said he might have heard something on the news, but didn't pay attention. What caught detectives off guard was a passing comment he made without realizing its weight. When they mentioned that the section of road had reopened days after Audrey disappeared, Coleman said, almost under his breath, that road wasn't supposed to reopen for weeks. It was an odd thing to say, something only a person closely involved in the project would know. Yet in every record investigators reviewed, there was no documented delay, no extended closure. The ground had been declared stable and the project completed. As the interview went on, Coleman became defensive. He denied ever meeting Audrey or having any contact with her. But his memory was vague, and when detectives asked for the names of his workers from that period, he claimed he couldn't remember any of them. He said all his old records had been destroyed in a flood years earlier. After the interview, detectives sent the old evidence from the excavation site to the Kentucky State Crime Lab. Among the samples was a partial fingerprint recovered from inside the car's gas cap, the same one the lab had been unable to match in the 1990s due to poor quality. With modern analysis, they enhanced the print digitally. The results came back 3 weeks later. The print matched James R. Coleman. It wasn't enough on its own to prove murder, but it placed him in contact with Audrey's vehicle. The evidence tied him to the scene more directly than anyone else in 21 years. Detectives quietly reopened the case as a homicide investigation. They began interviewing former employees of Coleman Excavation Services. A few were still alive and living in the area. Most didn't remember much, but one man, David Laird, a retired bulldozer operator, provided a lead. He recalled a night in late October 1994 when Coleman showed up to the site after hours, telling everyone to go home early because of storm damage. The next morning, the crew returned to find a large section of the ground freshly graded. Coleman told them to leave it as it was, saying it had already been taken care of. At the time, no one questioned it. It wasn't unusual for Coleman to work odd hours, but after hearing about the discovery in 2015, Laird said it had never sat right with him. Armed with that statement, detectives brought Coleman back in for questioning. This time, they confronted him directly with the fingerprint match and the soil analysis. He denied everything, again, saying he might have touched the car if he'd stopped to help a stranded driver, but insisted he'd never harmed anyone. When they asked if he remembered a blue Honda Civic near the site that night, his eyes flickered for the briefest moment before he said no. Prosecutors began preparing for a possible indictment, but they needed one more solid connection, something irrefutable. The problem was time. 21 years had washed away almost all physical evidence. In an effort to find new leads, detectives re-interviewed locals who had lived near the bypass in 1994. One elderly couple remembered seeing construction lights running late one night, just days after Audrey disappeared. They said they heard machinery-heavy engines, backhoes long after curfew hours, but assumed it was routine. They never saw Coleman personally, but they remembered something else. A truck that wasn't one of the company's usual fleet. A dark green pickup, old model, parked off the shoulder. The description was a match to the one seen idling beside Audrey's car at the gas station, the last confirmed sighting of her alive. When detectives checked Coleman's historical vehicle records, they found he'd owned a 1983 Ford F-150, dark green, registered in his name until 1998. The same make and color the gas station attendant had described 21 years earlier. Piece by piece, the case began to solidify. The soil disturbance wasn't natural. The tarp and residue weren't random. The fingerprint wasn't a coincidence. And the man who leased the land, worked the equipment, and owned the matching truck had left a trail he'd assumed time would bury with her. In early November 2015, the sheriff's office announced they had identified a person of interest in the death of Audrey Mae. They didn't release his name publicly, not yet, but everyone in the county knew. Coleman's house was soon surrounded. by reporters. He refused interviews. When approached by a journalist on his driveway, he said only, "People dig too deep. They find things that were better left alone." By the winter of that year, the evidence was being reviewed by the state attorney's office. They couldn't yet prove premeditation, but the circumstantial and forensic links were damning. Prosecutors believed Audrey had likely stopped for directions or been followed after leaving the gas station. They theorized that Coleman, working late or patrolling his site, had encountered her, assaulted her, and buried both her and the car using his own machinery before the ground crew returned the next morning. When confronted with this theory, Coleman didn't answer. He sat quietly, his hands folded, staring at the table. Then, after several long seconds, he murmured, almost to himself, "That road wasn't supposed to reopen for weeks." It wasn't an admission, but to detectives who'd spent months tracing his lies, it was the closest thing to one. The investigation, after 21 years, was no longer about a missing person. It was about justice. And within a year, that justice would finally catch up to James R. Coleman, the man who thought he could bury a secret deep enough that the earth itself would forget. When the forensic results came back, there was no longer room for doubt. The fingerprint match, the soil analysis, the old equipment residue, all of it formed a picture too complete to ignore. Investigators brought James R. Coleman in one final time. The tone of the interview was different, now less patient, more direct. The detectives laid out everything they had: the lease records, the gas cap print, the matching truck, the witness statements. For the first time, Coleman didn't deny it outright. He just sat there, staring at the table, his breathing shallow, his hands motionless. It started small, his confession. A single sentence here and there, buried between excuses. He said he'd seen her that night, at the Amoco station, and that she looked lost. He said she'd asked for directions to the highway, that he'd offered to show her the shortcut, a back road he used for work trucks. From there, the story shifted. He claimed she panicked, that she misunderstood his intentions. But as investigators pressed, the fragments began to align, painting a darker truth. Coleman had followed Audrey Mae out of the gas station and onto Route 90. At some point, near a small roadside pull-off, he confronted her. He claimed it was just conversation, that she'd been kind, that she laughed politely. But when she resisted his advance, he struck her. Once, hard enough to render her unconscious. He said he didn't mean to kill her, that it just happened too fast. He dragged her into her own car, drove the Civic to the edge of his construction site, and waited until the last truck left for the night. Then, using his earth mover, he dug into the soft slope meant for the future lane expansion. He lowered the car in, covered it with fill dirt, compacted it with the machine, and left before sunrise. The way he described it, calm, mechanical, chilled the detectives in the room. He talked about it like a job he'd done and forgotten. He said he'd gone home and showered, then showed up the next morning as if nothing had happened. When asked why he'd done it, his only answer was, "I couldn't let them find her." Not there. In his written confession, Coleman denied any premeditation. He called it a mistake, but the evidence told a different story. The intentional burial, the leveled soil, the tarp, it wasn't panic. It was planning. The district attorney's office filed formal charges of first-degree murder and tampering with evidence. Coleman was arrested at his home without incident. Neighbors watched from their porches as he was led away in handcuffs, a frail man in a faded denim jacket, his face expressionless. News of his arrest rippled through Kentucky. For the Mae family, it was both relief and devastation. Harold, now in his 70s, told reporters he didn't feel justice, just emptiness. "He buried my daughter like she was nothing," he said quietly. And the world kept driving over her all those years. The trial began in the spring of 2016. It didn't last long. Coleman's defense argued diminished memory, failing health, and lack of intent. But the prosecution's case was straightforward and damning. They played audio from his confession, read forensic reports aloud, and displayed photographs of the excavation site, the car buried beneath 20 years of soil and pine roots. Jurors sat in silence as they listened. When the verdict came back, it was unanimous. guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Coleman to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. At the sentencing hearing, Audrey's younger brother, Daniel, now in his 30s and a father himself, stood to speak. His voice was steady, but there was a tremor behind it. "We drove that road 1,000 times," he said, looking directly at Coleman. "And she was right there, beneath us. Every mile, every memory we were passing over her." Coleman didn't look up. He kept his eyes fixed on the table, as if the words couldn't reach him. In the weeks that followed, the site where Audrey's car had been found became something of a memorial. Strangers left flowers and photographs along the roadside. Students from Western Kentucky University held a small vigil, reading her name aloud, one final time. The county eventually placed a small plaque at the site, simple, unmarked except for her initials, A.M. 1971 to 1994. For investigators, it was a rare kind of closure. They'd spent months combing through a past most people had long stopped caring about. Now, standing on that same hillside, they could finally see the full picture. A young woman's drive home, a moment of chance, and a man who believed the earth would keep his secret forever. The story might have ended there, but one final detail stayed with those who worked the case. When the forensic team first unearthed the Honda Civic, the interior had collapsed inward from years of pressure. But one thing inside had remained almost untouched, a small silver keychain in the shape of a crescent moon. It had been clipped to the ignition ring, still faintly polished, as if time itself hadn't dared to touch it. That keychain was returned to Audrey's family after the trial. Daniel kept it on his own keyring for a while, before deciding to place it beside his mother's headstone. He said it belonged there, between the two people who had waited longest for the truth. In the end, the answers came, but at a cost no one could measure. A case that had haunted a family, a community, and an entire generation of law enforcement had finally reached its conclusion. And as the years passed, the world moved on. The construction site became part of a residential neighborhood, a row of houses now standing over the same ground where Audrey's car had once been buried. But those who remember still speak of it quietly: the pines, the fog, the feeling that something had been watching from beneath the earth all those years. The final image in every report, every documentary, every news special about her case is always the same: Audrey Mae's senior photo, her smile soft, her eyes bright, fading into an aerial shot of that pine-covered hillside, the place that kept her secret for 21 years. And for the Mae family, that hillside will always be sacred ground, not because of what was lost there, but because it's where the truth finally came home.